morning, everyone. Welcome to the Senate Rules and Administration Select Subcommittee on Federal Impacts on Minnesotans and Economic Stability. I call this session to order. It is February 20th, 2026 at 10:05. Today we will be hearing a report on the federal impacts on our economic stability as we look into 2026 planning. We have Anna Mengi, our state budget director, here with us to go through that. And after that, we're going to adopt the remaining reports, including one that Eric Nauman is working on for this committee. And then we will adjourn for the session-ish. Senator Rasmussen?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So there's a report that is being worked on, or could you give some more detail on that?
Yes, we have a draft of it. It's been posted for a couple of days. It is based on the information that Anna will be sharing that Eric Nauman put together. And if there are additions today, new information, then he'll ask for the ability to adjust that report. Senator Rasmussen?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Now I think I know what you're talking about, which was a report that is in our packet that was authored yesterday describing testimony that has not been presented yet. And I've, Madam Chair, brought up kind of the unprecedented nature of having these nonpartisan summaries of partisan proceedings, but this is new technology where we have a report that's included in our packet that talks about what someone is going to be sharing with us today. And I just guess, Madam Chair, I don't know if anyone can answer this. Have we ever done this before where we prepared a committee report or a summary of a meeting that hasn't even happened yet?
Senator Rasmussen, thank you for your concern. We are, oftentimes, council and fiscal are able to prepare, legislators are able to prepare based on information Anna Mengi was able to share with nonpartisan staff the presentation that she's giving today so that we would be able to have a report based on that information in the presentation that she will be delivering. And if there's additional information that she delivers today that is not in that, that is where we will give fiscal staff and Senate Council the ability to adjust that information if it changes based on what was sent over as the presentation. Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I think it's totally appropriate to have Director Mengi have the ability to post a presentation, or she could post her remarks to this committee and offer them of what she's going to say ahead of time. But we have a document that has been prepared by SCRFA that says Anna Mengi, State Budget Director from the Director of Management and Budget, testified and provided a federal funds update to the subcommittee. Director Mengi concluded her testimony with several remarks related to the Minnesota state budget process. Specifically, she discussed, and it goes into all this detail that hasn't yet been provided. And if Director Mengi wants to, come and talk to the committee, and then we can listen to what she has to say, we can ask SCRFA to put together a summary of it. But this is just, I think, I understand the pressures of the schedule, but we don't need to operate this way. We can listen to testimony, we can ask questions, and then we can put together minutes or summary discussions. But I don't think it's appropriate to presuppose. I don't know why we're here, I guess. If we already know what's going to happen, I don't know why we're even having this conversation today.
Noted. Members, any other questions? Okay. To get into today's testimony, I just want to ground us in when this committee started 5 months ago. We got some questions about the purpose of its work, and some asked even if it was necessary. Clearly that continues today. What kind of federal impacts were we expecting? I know in Health and Human Services, the women around the table were called literally hysterical for worrying about the cuts and impacts that were coming. We were told it would never happen and that we were overreacting. Did we really need to have any of these hearings? But I'm noticing something interesting now that we're back in session, and it's that almost all of the hearings are about federal impacts. The tax committee is asking why, how, or why not to conform with the tax code Republicans passed in Congress last year, and the Health and Human Services Committee learned about the catastrophic cuts to healthcare passed in that same bill. Education committees are taking testimony about the effect of ICE scaring children out of school. The Housing Committee talked about the support for renters who can't make ends meet because of the economic fallout from Operation Metro Surge. Operation Metro Surge was also covered by our colleagues in the House yesterday in the Workforce, Labor, and Economic Development Committee as they examine the economic impacts on our local businesses. And as we speak, the Judiciary Committee is also meeting on a hearing to protect Minnesotans' rights and restore accountability by the federal government. And here today, we will meet to learn our state budget from our state budget leaders, what decisions made by Donald Trump, his cabinet, and the Republicans in Congress mean for Minnesotans. This hearing grew out of a series of briefings that legislators and state leaders got from the people who monitor our budget, our bank accounts, and revenue streams, and the programs that they pay for. What we learned in those meetings was frankly infuriating and terrifying. And not just because of the chartered trajectories that we're seeing across our sectors here in the legislature, but because we know it's more than just numbers. As the members of this committee have learned, these statistics are people's jobs and livelihoods. They are household budgets. They are literally the food on the table, money in the bank, and medicine in the cabinet. They are matters of Minnesotans staying employed, in stable housing, and remaining healthy and alive. As I think that those following today will see, the things that we learned in those meetings were so troubling that they must be public conversation so Minnesotans can know what's happening now, what's coming next, and who's responsible for it. Today, we welcome State Budget Director at Minnesota Management and Budget, Anna Mingy, to the subcommittee for an examination of the funding cuts and fiscal uncertainties that we're facing this legislative session. Director Mingy, if you would please come forward, join us at the testimony table, and when you're ready, please introduce yourself for the record and begin your testimony. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I'm Anna Mingy, State Budget Director with Minnesota Management and Budget. And today I'll be walking through an overview of the impacts of federal funding changes to the state budget, with specifically focusing on changes made at both the congressional level through the passage of H.R. 1, the Federal Reconciliation Bill last summer, as well as changes made through the federal administration through executive action. Before I get into the specific changes, I want to ground us in the significance of federal funds to the state budget. You know, in a lot of our conversations, we talk about the state general fund. That is the largest source of state funding, but in actuality, the state budget is a lot more than just the general fund, and federal dollars make up more than 1 in every $3 that the state government spends. These funds are largely concentrated in the Health and Human Services area, but not exclusively. Federal government pays for important transportation projects, public health, education, nutrition, healthcare, just to name a few. In terms of the sheer magnitude of awards, our state agencies are managing about 650 distinct federal awards that make up over $23 billion this year alone. So it's a lot of work. You know, a lot that goes into it, a lot of separate uses that agencies are managing. You know, there are some really significant awards, like we'll talk about Medicaid and SNAP today, but there are also a lot of small, distinct competitive grants. One dynamic that I will be talking about several times today is the use of federal dollars to support state-level entitlement programs. We estimate over $15 billion of 2025 awards support state entitlement. So these are programs and benefits that the state has a legal obligation to provide regardless of funding source. So that means when we lose federal funds, it creates a budgetary obligation on other state funds for the state government to provide the services required under law. Most of these entitlements are in health and human services and education. So with any change in federal administration and changes in sort of political control, we anticipate changes in the federal funding relationship. I would say since January of 2025, the nature of those changes have been significant. Beginning in January 2025, a number of executive orders were issued that had ramifications for federal grants received by state government. We also received in January a number of pauses on federal funds, leading the Attorney General to file a number of lawsuits against the federal government. Many of those pauses were paused or put on hold, and some were sort of canceled. We then, sort of as we moved through the spring, we started to receive actual terminations of grants for a variety of reasons. One mechanism that we have seen over the last year has been termination for convenience, or termination because a federal grant no longer aligns with the policy goals of a new administration. In April of 2025, the new administration introduced new terms and conditions to be applied to federal awards. And we began experiencing, as we moved into the summer, delays in expected notices of awards. And this sounds, it sounds technical, it is largely technical, but state agencies plan for their operations under the assumption that things will operate generally on the same timeline as they have historically. And so delays do result in delays of services for Minnesotans. Then in July of last year, as you all have heard about over the course of this committee, the federal government passed H.R. 1, the Federal Reconciliation Bill, sometimes referred to as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which had significant ramifications for programs administered by state government, as well as other impacts to Minnesotans. The H.R. 1 also included, in addition to big changes to federal entitlement programs, included some specific cancellations of federal grants to the state of Minnesota, or to states sort of generally. We have received sort of, since that time, additional non-continuations of various grant awards, and as I think folks were tracking, in October and November managed through a federal government shutdown. Sort of since November of 2025, we have sort of moved into a new phase of interactions with the federal government and federal funding. We have received both sort of actual or attempted cuts to grants, as well as sort of threats or potential cuts to other funding streams. Most of those are in various stages of appeal or court challenge, but I'll talk about those in greater detail. Sort of with that sort of overarching timeline of the last 13 months or so, I'll sort of pivot to talk about H.R. 1, which of the various impacts, I think has some of the most concrete and significant impacts to the state budget. So folks here are aware, I'm sure, that on July 4th, President Trump signed H.R. 1 into law. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that the bill would cost $3.4 trillion over the next 10 years on net. So that was about $4.5 trillion in net tax cuts, offset by about $1.1 trillion in spending reductions. We have, that bill came out in the summer, and agencies worked very hard to do preliminary analysis because there was a need for folks to understand what that meant for Minnesotans. We talked about our analysis at that time. So what I'll be showing today is a refined analysis, but I want to make sure we're clear that these estimates will continue to evolve. There are a number of provisions of the law for which we still don't have guidance. There are places where legislative action is required, and that could change how it affects the state budget. So these are still very much estimates, but are improved since the work we did over the summer. So I want to spend the bulk of my time talking about provisions relating to healthcare and food assistance. I know you have heard about some of the specific policy provisions, so I'm going to highlight those with fiscal and budgetary ramifications for the state. These are by no means a comprehensive list of the provisions of the law, but we can categorize these generally in three large groups. So impacts on eligibility for enrollees. Some important provisions here are the implementation of work reporting requirements for adults without children, as well as changes to eligibility for legal non-citizens. There are things that will impact our providers and medical assistance, including limits on retroactive coverage, so the period for which providers can bill after someone is found eligible for medical assistance, as well as instituting new limits on Medicaid-directed payments. And the final group that I would highlight are those that impact the financial stability of both our healthcare sector as well as the state. So new limitations on provider taxes, as well as the imposition of state penalties for eligibility errors. Looking at nutrition assistance, we're speaking sort of in this space specifically about the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which some folks have formerly referred to as food stamps. So as a reminder, SNAP provides a monthly benefit for folks on an EBT card that eligible individuals and families can use to buy food. A few of the changes that HR 1 made established work requirements for adults without dependents, sort of expanded existing work requirements to sort of older groups, and then also changed benefit levels. So that means we don't know, it's hard to predict exactly the fiscal impact because it relies on future inflationary calculations, but meaning that future payments will be less than they would have been otherwise. But there are also some large impacts to the state financial resources. The first major change is that SNAP now includes a non-federal share of benefits for states based on payment error rate. Historically, the SNAP program benefits have been 100% federally funded, and now there is a non-federal share of those benefits. The other change that I would highlight from the financing side is an increase in the administrative share that has to be paid by the sort of non-federal administrator. So in the state, that's both the state government as well as counties. So the federal administrative reimbursement rates for SNAP is falling from 50% to 25% starting this October. So that's a significant increase in the cost to both the state and counties. This chart has a lot of information, and I am certainly not going to walk through all of the provisions, but what I want folks to take away is that the implementation of the provisions of this law is occurring on a rolling basis. There are some provisions that are taking effect right away, and there are others that are being phased in over time. And the reason that we highlight this is because that means some of the fiscal impacts won't be fully experienced sort of by both the state budget or by our healthcare providers until out to 30, 31, 32. And it's that rolling nature that makes some of the near-term fiscal estimates a little smaller than we expect them to be when fully implemented. So there are a number of ways that these provisions sort of could impact the state budget, and I think of them generally in three categories. There are some where they will automatically hit the state budget. You can think of those as things that are in the budget forecast because state law says we do something regardless of what the federal government does. There are also places where we will need additional appropriations to comply with the law or to make the required changes, and they are not reflected in the budget forecast because it's not consistent with state law. And then finally, there is, I think in the largest grouping, places where we are anticipating to lose significant federal resources that will create pressure for policymakers who have to decide whether and how much to mitigate the loss of federal resources, creating just a larger pressure on the state budget. So with that grounding, this slide provides sort of a summary of our analysis of the lost federal funds to state-administered programs resulting from H.R. 1. And so the bars represent sort of how much we're losing in federal funds in a given biennium. So we're focusing just on the state forecast horizon because that's the period for which we have solid data to do estimates. So the dark blue bars are the current biennium and the green bars are the next. On the far left of the graph, you can see we've calculated a total, so to the left of those dashed lines. But as you move to the right, those are the component parts that roll up into the total, broken apart in some of those categories I just discussed. So on total, we estimate that the H.R. 1 will result in $327 million in less federal funds in the current biennium and about $1.6 billion in the next biennium, the tails. So if we move to the right of that dashed line, the first set of columns refer to those automatic general fund or other fund costs that result from the passage of this law. Generally, you can think of these things as things that we incorporated into the November forecast, or that will, if we could learn of things in the future that would make this bar get larger. And the numbers here, it's $223 million this biennium and $480 million in the second. The two columns to the right of that reflect the cost the state needs to fund in order to comply with changes under the law. So that's $12 million this biennium and $195 million in the second. The largest thing in this category is the benefit costs for the new benefit costs for the state share of SNAP. And those last two sets of columns reflect provisions that do not necessarily implicate the state budget, but raise those questions for policymakers. And you can see that there are several federal grants that have been canceled under H.R. 1, which really just results in less money flowing through the state. But most dramatically, I'd draw your attention to the columns farthest to the right. So over time, the largest impacts of this legislation will be to entities other than state government. So that's about $37 million this biennium, $909 million in the second, but that column grows significantly outside of the budget horizon. So this is costs to our hospitals, counties, sort of partners in administering human services programs, as well as some impacts to beneficiaries. And so while these costs don't necessarily directly impact the state budget, I think you can all understand the significant pressures that they create on both our delivery system and the demands for additional state financial support. So with that overview, I'm going to next pivot to some of the administrative changes we've been experiencing, focusing on some of the grant and sort of executive action that we've had since November. But first,
Madam Chair, could I ask a question on the previous page?
Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Director Mingy. When you're looking at these cost calculations, like for example, on the automatic state costs, other state costs, are those numbers calculated relative to the pre-budget forecast, or is this in terms of like absolute dollars coming in from the federal government?
Director Mingy.
Madam Chair, Senator Rasmussen, so these are estimates using the November forecast baseline based on enrollment projections at the time. So for example, and we have a write-up about this in the November forecast booklet, but there are certain groups that are no longer eligible for medical assistance. So we are losing federal financial support, and that's a number that we are quantifying based on enrollment projections sort of at that time.
Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Director Mingy. So yeah, I understand that this is relative to the forecast. Do you know how much is overall federal funding into these state administered programs changing? Is that number going up? Is it going down? If we just look at the total amount of money year over year and projected over the current budget and the next biennium.
Director Mingy.
Madam Chair, Senator Rasmussen, certainly most of the impacts here are to medical assistance. I think as we have highlighted, medical assistance is growing as a program over time, and as federal funds are a significant portion of that, that is federal funds that are growing over time as well.
Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So follow-up question for Director Mingy. So it would be my assumption, just given the tens of billions of dollars that we get from the federal government for state Medicaid, that if we were to just look year over year, 2025, 2026, 2027, 2028, that in each of those years we'll be getting more money from the federal government for state Medicaid program every single year. It's going to go up and up and up. And I would guess that if you look at the cost over years, Director Mingy, do you have a sense of how many, is it hundreds of millions of dollars and more funding every year, billions of dollars more funding? Do you have a sense of what you'd expect that to look like over time?
Director Mingy.
Madam Chair, Senator Rasmussen, I'm happy to follow up with the specifics. My estimate would be hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars sort of year over year, depending on the year and sort of policy changes.
Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I just want to make sure that committee members understand this. This is against the forecast. The state of Minnesota, MMB, what we heard from Director Mingy is that every year the state of Minnesota is going to be getting more and more money from the federal government for our state Medicaid program, and that over this budget horizon, it could be hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars more in additional funding. And Madam Chair, just want to remind members, as we were looking at last year's budget, if we look at Governor Walz's budget proposal and we look at the cuts to forecasts that he proposed for disability services in nursing homes, it was more than $1.5 billion over 4 years. So I just want to put that number into perspective as we're taking a look at this page here. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Go ahead, Director Mingy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So pivoting away from HR 1, though, I'm happy to take additional questions on that as we continue. I wanted to spend some time talking about funding pauses and cancellations that we have been experiencing over the last 12 months. I would, in January of 2025, the state received a number of letters or notifications asking us to pause spending federal grants or attempting to cancel federal grants. And at that time, we realized it would be really beneficial to start a centralized tracker. So I would just share with the committee that there is available on the MMB website a tracker of all of the funds that are currently paused or have been permanently canceled over recent months. These, because they are current cancellations, they are not threatened cancellations, and they are not things that were paused and have been unpaused. This is really a snapshot in time, and the list, if we were to look comprehensively at what we've experienced, would be much longer. But we can say right now we have about 6 awards that are on hold, totaling about $491 million. 4 of them are in the public health space, and 2 are relating to clean energy and climate. The bulk of this is in a single award, and there are several other smaller awards. We've also had 13 specific awards canceled, many in the clean energy space, several in education, food assistance, and other areas, and those total about 157 awards. So these are things that have been confirmed. And the next slides, I'm going to talk about places where we have outstanding risks or where things are sort of under litigation that aren't included in these numbers. I'm
going to pause you for just a moment, Director. Senator May-Quade.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Director Mingy, I feel like I recall the 2 violence prevention grants, but I'm wondering if you can explain what those are and who they were for.
Director Mingy.
Madam Chair, let me just pull that up. So we have a targeted violence and terrorism prevention program grant at the Department of Public Safety through FEMA. We had about $445,000 canceled in that award. There was also a grant to the Department of Corrections for the Justice Reinvestment Initiative. It was received by the Office of Justice, through the Office of Justice Programs, and there we had about $400,000 canceled.
Senator Make-Wade?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, I mean, this is, you hear about all these grants and there's a lot of different pieces, especially the higher education hearing. I feel like you learned about all these things that were helping, groups of people, but canceling a targeted violence and terrorism prevention program, I feel like that doesn't bode well for safety outcomes in the state. I appreciate the details, and I would love to hear more. I mean, as we have to look at how do we backfill. Did that grant also require partnership with the federal government that we no longer have, so the money and the partnership, or was it just money and then the state could do its work?
Director Mingy?
So, Madam Chair, Senator Make-Wade, so the program that was canceled provides funding for states, local governments, tribal governments, as well as nonprofits and higher educational institutions to sort of establish or enhance capabilities. So these were largely, like some of it was things that were enhancing work that jurisdictions were already doing. I don't have a ton of detail about this. Happy to follow up with more to the committee.
Senator Make-Wade?
Thank you.
Go ahead, Director Mingy.
So the next round of slides are things where we have received notices from the federal government of places where they are intending to cancel grants or have attempted to cancel grants, but they aren't included in our tracking because they are currently on hold for a number of reasons. And I would say I have colleagues from state agencies who have additional expertise who are here if the committee is interested. But last week, MDH received notice from the Centers for Disease Control of a cancellation of 2 grants, as well as the intent to cancel 3 more. The largest of this is the Public Health Infrastructure Grant, and that's a $65 million award. The terminations, if they were to go forward, would result in cuts to local public health, tribal public health, funds to monitor and prevent HIV and STD infections, as well as funding for a significant number of employees at the health department. On February 12th, there was a multi-state lawsuit that resulted in a temporary restraining order pausing these terminations. So the work is ongoing, but it is under litigation, and these funds are certainly at risk. We have also in recent months received a number of notifications from the Administration for Children and Families that place several grant programs within the Department of Children, Youth, and Families under temporary administrative review. So a preliminary injunction has been put in place for this, so the federal government is prevented from withholding these funds, but it is something where, if allowed to continue, would create both significant impacts for the state budget as well as impacts to Minnesotans and service providers who are receiving these funds. And let me talk about that a little more. So I described earlier that there are some places where federal funds are supporting state level entitlements and where the general fund or other state fund would automatically fill in the gap. And then there are places where the loss of federal funds is more of a creation of budget pressure and a loss of services to Minnesotans. And these 3 large grant programs, the Child Care Development Fund, the TANF Block Grant, and Social Services Block Grant, represent a mixture of those 2. So if we look just at the Child Care Development Block Grant, it is the federal funding source for our child care assistance program, some of which is an entitlement. And if those funds were to sort of disappear, that would mean there's $33 million this fiscal year and $123 million next fiscal year that the state would need to identify in order to fund our obligations under that program. But then there's an even larger amount, about $196 million over the remainder of the biennium, that would result in lost services to Minnesotans, things like the basic sliding fee child care assistance program, which is not an entitlement. It is sort of, we pay for as much services as appropriations can support, as well as a number of other sort of grants in supporting the childcare sector. So in the TANF block grant, that is the federal funding source for the Minnesota Family Investment Program, a cash assistance program supporting thousands and thousands of Minnesotan families. Here, we have about $52 million of federal funds that we have yet to draw this year and 127 that we are counting on next year. So if that federal funding source were to go away, that's $180 million roughly that the general fund would need to identify in order to continue our obligations under this program. But then there are also significant grants supported through the TANF block grant, things like family home visiting, for example, that would sort of without this funding source or an additional state appropriation would need to be discontinued. And then the social services block grant doesn't fund a state level entitlement, but it is a significant source of funds supporting our work both at the state level, but also significant impacts for our county partners. So these are things that are not on our tracker, are not in the budget forecast because they are sort of on hold, and we are waiting to understand the outcome of any sort of decision there. And the final specific impact that I want to discuss is sort of a potential loss of federal funds resulting from a letter received from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services last month. So on January 6th, CMS, so this is the federal agency that oversees Medicaid and works really closely with our State Department of Human Services, but they indicated that they intend to withhold $515 million per quarter in future federal funds. And that $515 million was their estimate of the federal share of 14 high-risk services. The state, we don't know, so this withholding has not started, and we don't know when it would start or when it would stop. And that makes it really challenging for us to express the risk to the budget. But certainly 500, even if it was one quarter, that is a significant loss of funds. The funds could be returned once the federal government is satisfied with the corrective action plan and DHS demonstrates that those claims are valid, but that is a hypothetical and something that we are still not sort of confident in and working through. The Department of Human Services has submitted an administrative appeal as outlined in the letter, and that is currently pending. We don't know the outcome there. And so if you can think of this, that's sort of a forward-looking withholding of funds going forward. CMS in their letter also indicated that they would undertake a more retrospective review of recent claims for which we've already been reimbursed, and that could result in the deferral of additional federal funds. We are not sure sort of the scope of that review or the timing or how it will ultimately be resolved, but that's sort of would be in addition to or sort of instead of that $515 million per quarter. So it's an additional risk that we are grappling with.
So just to be clear, Director Mingy, we are looking at potentially, we have a like written threat, I guess, to potentially remove up to $2 billion a year that we don't know when it would happen. We don't know when it would end. We don't know if our appeal is going through. And that's not able, because we don't know the answer to any of those questions, that's not able to be contemplated in the forecast.
Madam Chair, I think that's correct. So with the $550 million a quarter, because we don't know the duration, if we annualize it, that's over $2 billion a year. This is a different approach to withholding federal funds for Medicaid than we typically see. Generally, without getting too deep into the DHS lane of expertise, generally the withholds are based on analysis of specific sets of claims, specific instances where claims are not eligible for federal funds, and so we are. There's a lot of uncertainty about how this would be implemented, and $2 billion loss. And I'll talk about this more in a second, we have a projected surplus of just under $2.5 billion. And so if you were to remove $2 billion from that, then we are left with a much smaller cushion to navigate the budget horizon. But because we are not sure, it's something that, we have a budget forecast coming out without getting ahead of that. This is something that would be really challenging to sort of incorporate with any level of confidence. But it's certainly a risk we want to make sure folks understand.
Thank you. Senator McQuaid.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Director Mingy, so in addition to the threat of withholding this additional $2 billion a year, so that's $4 billion a biennium, because we budget in bienniums. We also submitted many changes to our CMS plans in many of these high-risk services, and those haven't been approved yet. And we started, when we made our budget last year, we assumed that those would start Jan 1 when approved. And so I guess I'm wondering, in addition to the already withheld funds, canceled funds, and then changes in the one big bill that removed services and made us pay more to implement them, are we including in the forecast the lack of approval by the federal government of our changes for program integrity and our higher services and caps, and what that's costing the state?
Director Mingy.
Madam Chair, Senator McQuaid, I think some of those questions, it'd be better to wait until after the forecast we can answer with more specificity. The certain thing I would just say, we try to incorporate all of that sort of stuff that is known to the best of our ability. There is always risk, and we always like estimating when an approval will happen, but we always try to make sure that the forecast has our best available estimates.
Senator McQuaid.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Director McGee, so when we do, I guess the question that's coming up in my mind is, I know that there's a lot of things that start particularly with the cuts to Medicaid and then the increased cost to implement Medicaid that start next year. So we end session in May, and then those things will be implemented before we come back. Does this legislature need to make a bunch of decisions on how, for example, we can look at month by month somebody's Medicaid eligibility when currently it's not that? Do we need to make those decisions this session?
Director Mingy.
Madam Chair, Senator McQuaid, yes, there are a number of changes as a result of HR 1 that the state needs to implement prior to the next legislative session, and that you will be sort of hearing from state agencies about where state law changes will be required to implement them, and lack of compliance risks really, I think, significant financial penalty to the state.
Senator McQuaid.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Have we received guidance from the federal government on how to make those changes yet? That would be Medicaid, SNAP, I know are two big ones.
Director Mingy.
Madam Chair, Senator McQuaid, I think there are so many changes. I don't want to, I would say we do not have comprehensive guidance, no. Specifically, things like one of the biggest sets of changes are related to work reporting requirements for Medicaid. That is a place where we don't anticipate to receive guidance for several months yet. And so it's something we will need to sort of grapple with through this session.
Senator McQuaid.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I don't know how I would grapple with something that I don't have guidance on, and I don't know how agencies would give us, how they would instruct us on what laws needed to be changed and how, if you haven't received guidance on how to comply with the law. And I mean, this feels like the whole thing feels like budget sabotage, deliberate budget, or retribution, as it's been called by the president. But we budget responsibly here in the state of Minnesota. We have done that. And obviously we're going to have to, it feels like we'll have to do a whole new budget because of the massive changes, in the last 8 months. But I'm really worried about what happens Jan 1, 2027, and we're held accountable for not making changes during session that we could not have made because we hadn't received guidance from the federal government.
Director Mingy. You can just continue your presentation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Yeah, I would say these are risks that we are tracking and concerns that are shared. So the last conversation I wanted to make sure that we had is a sort of understanding of how all of these changes relate to our current budget forecast. So sort of as I've mentioned several times, for most of our federal state-funded forecast programs, reductions in federal funds trigger increases in state spending. But losses for non-forecast programs drive losses in services, which create budget pressures but don't automatically increase state spending. So as of the November 2025 forecast, we projected that the general fund would have a surplus this biennium of about $2.5 billion, but a negative balance in the next biennium of almost $3 billion. Because we don't know how much money we might lose or when it would happen, we can't say with precision how those losses would be managed. I would say that if we lost $515 million next week, that gives us a lot of lead time. But if we were to, for example, lose $2 billion in June of 2027, it would be a lot more challenging. And those are just scenarios that we can't plan for in this sort of lack of information, although we certainly have thought a lot about it. So if we lose for the current biennium more than the size of the surplus of $2.465 billion, that would mean we'd need near-term action this biennium to balance the budget. But if any reduction that we take, whether it's more or less than $2.5 billion, that means that the shortfall out in the planning years is worse. And so, although we have sort of money on the bottom line this biennium that allows us sort of some cushion to manage through losses in the short term, those are sort of losses of funds that we will need to grapple with eventually.
Director Mingy, can you help me understand what happens if, like, we go through this legislative session and we leave some amount of money on the bottom line, and then post-session, new rules or, the $515 million or whatever, some reduction in federal funds that was not planned for in our legislative session happens that is larger than what we left on the bottom line. Like, what happens?
So, Madam Chair, if the legislature adjourns in May and in June, we find out that we have lost $3 billion in funds for a state level entitlement, then we would be looking at a projected shortfall in the current biennium, which we can't have we have to have a balanced budget. Mm-hmm. There are a number of choices that policymakers will have to make about, we'd have to look at the cash flow for the state budget to understand the timeline. Theoretically, it might be something that we could manage until the legislature comes in the following session. It could be something that would require earlier action, and that's something we would need to work with the governor and you all to understand how you'd sort of want to proceed.
Thank you. Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to make sure if Director Mingy's gotten through her presentation, I just had some questions at the end.
Yeah, Madam Chair, yeah, that is the conclusion. Thank you.
Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Director Mingy, thanks for the presentation today. Do you know, in terms of, and I'm looking at the PowerPoint page where you have the fiscal estimates of lost federal funding, does that include, for example, I know that I've gotten an update from the Minnesota Department of Health on this, about $200 million that they've received for fiscal support to healthcare entities in Minnesota. Is that reflected in this chart?
Director Mingy.
Madam Chair, let me look at my piece of paper. Madam Chair, Senator Rasmussen, I'm sorry, I cannot recall if that is included. It is something that, if it's not in here, that we probably would want to incorporate, but I just need to, would need to double check with the team.
Senator Rasmussen?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Director Mingy. An additional question I had is, if you're looking at, some of these base changes, I mean, in terms of the overall federal funding we get, I mean, can you give us a sense of what % change this is, over the course of the current biennium and the next biennium? Do you have any sense of, how much on a percentage basis this is changing what we're getting from the federal government?
Director Mingy?
Madam Chair, Senator Rasmussen, so when we're calculating on a percentage basis, this is a little tricky because some of the losses are for funds that are not flowing through state government. So, for example, the loss of the hospital-directed payment program is not something that we account for in the same way in the state budget. But certainly, if we look just at those automatic state forecast impacts, $480 million is a small percentage of the sort of roughly $50 billion that we get every biennium in federal funds.
Senator Rasmussen?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Director Mingy. I just did like some very quick back of the envelope math, but I mean, when you look at the tens of billions of dollars we get from the federal government, and you look at the numbers that are presented here, and even if we don't take into account other funds that might be flowing through MDE for healthcare entities in Minnesota, I mean, my math shows that it's well under 1%, even less than 0.5% of the total federal funding we're getting. Does that sound about right?
Director Mingy?
Yeah, Madam Chair, I think that sounds about right.
Senator Rasmussen?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Had a question. One of the updates that we had in the November forecast was pulling out the cost of a housing stabilization program that was shut down because it was riddled with fraud. Are we going to be expecting to see any additional savings in the forecast when it comes to trying to take fraud out of our state budget?
Director Mingy?
Madam Chair, Senator Rasmussen, we will have a much more comprehensive briefing for you all a week from today. I would think it's safe to say we do have significantly more information now about some of the impacts of the work that Department of Human Services has been doing than we did in the November forecast, and we will hope to have some of that reflected in our analysis.
Senator Rasmussen?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Director Mingy. Because I think for me that's a question I get from Minnesotans is, how much fraud is in our state budget and what we could do with that money if we're able to stop it from going to fraudsters, and especially in these high-risk Medicaid programs where we have career prosecutors saying that billions of tax dollars are going to criminals that should be going to people who need services. And I think, we had Governor Walz in his budget last year proposed $1.5 billion in cuts to disability services and nursing homes. By the way, that would have had a $3 billion impact on providers because we would have lost out on a state Medicaid match. And I think, Minnesotans want us to focus on making sure the dollars go where they're supposed to go and protecting tax dollars. So I look forward to having more conversations with the administration and trying to estimate what amount of our state budget is going to fraud so that we can better direct that resources to Minnesotans who need it, especially in a time when we're having to prioritize where dollars should go.
Senator McQuaid?
Thank you, Madam Chair. We used to have career prosecutors that were prosecuting fraud, but they quit because the federal government was asking them to do illegal things. But Director Mingy, I would like to ask you, I'm looking at something here from the Hospital Association and something from the from the Minnesota counties. And I want to ask you to kind of, when we sit on committees and we talk about budgets and committees, really like the Finance Committee or the Budget Office or Ways and Means, they kind of look at the whole picture. And so I want you to just describe to me if 160 or 60,000 Minnesotans are no longer enrolled and they're insured, no longer insured. And then they're having to go to hospitals. I think the Hospital Association is estimating an increase of $115 million in charity care, and then an estimated $262 million loss in ACA market revenues, individual market revenues. What does something like that end up doing to the state budget, aside from the $480 million we're losing in a year?
Director Mengy.
Madam Chair, Senator May Quaid, I think the healthcare system relies on a mix of various payers, and certainly Medicaid, which is a largely state-funded program, covers over 1 million people in Minnesota. And I think these are places where we may not see direct budgetary impacts, but the need for funding for our healthcare system is something that would end up as something that would either flow directly through some of our managed care contracts, or potentially be pressures for you all, sort of as you grapple with budgets in future sort of sessions, the need to support the healthcare system. But I know my colleagues from the Department of Health and Human Services are here as well, who could probably speak to that in greater detail.
Senator May Quaid.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so, Director Mengy, thinking about the counties, so we have our share at the state level, what we will have to pay more to administer fewer SNAP benefits, but the counties also have to pay more to administer fewer SNAP benefits. What will that look like for Minnesotans? How will that impact money?
Director Mengy.
Madam Chair, Senator May Quaid. So I think certainly as counties need to take on additional costs to administer services, county policymakers will need to make decisions about whether to reduce services in order to absorb those costs or to raise revenues, which could result in changes in property tax levies, for example.
Senator May Quaid.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And, I live in Dakota County, so I can tell you what they have said publicly, which is we're looking at, 9% property tax increase this year, maybe 9% next year. And that is, again, more money for fewer people to get services. At the $600 million federal energy grant that was terminated, once folks don't have, what would that look like? Maybe on my energy bill, or maybe needing more money for energy assistance. How could that impact the state budget?
Director Mengy.
Madam Chair, I think there are sort of two impacts from the energy sort of side. Certainly I think analysis of the impacts of HR 1 are that rates will increase, which as we've discussed, certainly creates sort of pressure on households and can flow through to pressure for state funding. There will also be, I think, potential increases on the electricity bills that the state pays for ourselves for our state buildings.
Senator May Quaid.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Director Mengy, when we cut assistance to food, to healthcare, but we increase the number of people needing to administer fewer benefits, does that also cost more money, whether it's the state level? Will we need to hire more people at the state level, as the county level, city level?
Director Mengy.
Madam Chair, I think in order to comply with some of these changes, we do anticipate the need for additional administrative capacity.
Senator May Quaid.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so, just so I'm clear, the state will need to hire more people to administer less health care and less food benefits, less energy assistance, less rental assistance to the people of Minnesota. Am I hearing that correctly?
Director Mengy.
Madam Chair, Senator May Quaid, yes, our estimates that we will need sort of additional capacity in order to implement these changes.
Senator May Quaid.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so if I'm thinking just like a person, which I am, I'm just basically a suburban mom, and I'm thinking about my total bills, right? So I'm thinking about my healthcare costs, I'm thinking about my food costs, I'm thinking about my property taxes, You know, am I going to just feel like a 1% squeeze on my individual budget because the federal government is only taking 1% of Minnesota's state budget?
Director Mengy.
Madam Chair, I think certainly the impacts for some households will be significant, and I would assume, especially for those losing some benefits or purchasing health care on the individual market, it will be significant. I'm not able to sort of speak to the specific magnitude.
Senator McQuaid.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And our child care funding, now that has been threatened, and then that is paused, or is that in court? Where is that at?
Madam Chair, Senator, the child care funding is sort of they're subject to a preliminary injunction, sort of, so it's on hold through the litigation.
Senator McQuaid.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And will you remind me, so that the amount of money that was, and how long, and maybe this is a question for the Attorney General, how long we anticipate this litigation to continue?
Director Mengy.
So, Madam Chair, I cannot speak to the duration of litigation. The sort of the total outstanding in this fiscal year for the Child Care Development Block Grant that we've yet to draw down is about $63 million. Next year, it's about $290 million.
Senator McQuaid.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so if we're not able to draw down, I mean, I know it's very likely my child care center would close, and I'm sure countless more. What does that do to the state budget if there's fewer people working, whether it's because they have to stay home with their child or their business closed? What does that do to the state budget?
Director Mengy.
Madam Chair, Senator, I think some of those implications are probably secondary, or sort of flowing through sort of the economic analysis and labor force participation. Certainly, I think we've heard from the state economists that we have anticipated very slow labor force growth in our forecast horizon, so the loss of labor force participation would be a challenge to the state budget.
Senator McQuaid.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think my last question, so I do a lot of work with my colleagues as state representatives, state senators in other states, and I assume that that happens at the enterprise level as well. In states where there's, the highest levels of fraud, Texas, Florida, or if we're going per capita, Arkansas, Missouri, do you talk to their state budget directors about how threats from the federal government to withhold their funding over fraud, how that impacts their budget?
Director Mengy.
Madam Chair, I have not spoken with my colleagues in those states. We do have conversations with colleagues from states like Illinois, California, and others who've been subject to, or Colorado, some of these more recent terminations. And these are sort of concerns that we all share in terms of how to manage over time.
Senator McQuaid.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Director McGee, I'll note that there's a commonality in the states you do talk to. It's that they're led by Democratic governors and likely legislatures. But the states that actually have the highest levels of fraud, right, are Republican-led states. And we know President Trump has been pardoning fraudsters since 2020. Do we prohibit those Medicaid fraudsters from operating in Minnesota, the ones that Trump pardoned, or is there a lack of criminal history now that they've received a pardon, make it harder for us to check into that?
Director Mengy.
Madam Chair, I'm not able to speak to that. I'm not aware, but I'm not sure if anyone from DHS would be able to respond to that question. Or we can follow up with the committee.
That sounds good.
That'd be great.
Yep. Just to add one thing, Senator Dibble, I'll come to you next, but on the first page of your presentation, you talked about how the federal government is about a third of our funding. About 2/3 is taxes. Can you give me like a ballpark of what percentage of that is sales tax?
Madam Chair, I don't, I'm looking at Mr. Nauman. I think of our general fund revenues, I think income tax is about half. I think sales tax is around 20 to 25%, but we can follow up with the committee.
Okay. Well, that's a helpful ballpark, because I'm just thinking about like suburban mom that I am too, and my neighbors, and like how we spend our money in Minnesota. And, you know, I'm thinking about the fact that when we had the conversation about SNAP here in the committee, one of the groups that came to testify was the grocers, because it's 12% across Minnesota of their income. The spending that happens in their stores is because of SNAP. So 60,000 people are not on SNAP. Like, that is a loss of income for those stores, which I presume relates to taxes businesses pay. And it is like it's now money that those people will have to come up with to buy their own groceries, which means that money's coming from somewhere. And if that pressure is being put on families, like this, you know, as you were talking about, like the child care assistance program, which helps providers, the base sliding fee grants, like help bridge that gap for families who can't afford childcare based on their income. And if they now have to pick up that entire income cost, like that is not an automatic impact to the general fund. That is $190 million over the next 18 months. That is not, oh, okay. That is like not on this bottom line, but is certainly on Minnesotans' bottom line. And that will have to impact what then people have to spend on things that are taxed, things that are not the necessities that we don't tax here in Minnesota. So I have to assume that if even these things that don't affect the general fund, that we don't necessarily have to backfill, that they will have an economic impact on what we take in. And if we're seeing, you know, 1% on the federal side, and then we see a shrinkage of sales tax and income tax, because now some people are gonna have to stay home and care for their kids instead of putting them in childcare. Some businesses are gonna close. Like this also affects our part of this pie. Am I like puzzling that out correctly, Director Mingy?
Madam Chair, I think you're right. I think, you know, my presentation certainly focused on those things that we are best able to quantify and some of the specific funds flowing into the state budget. But the impacts of the economic changes to Minnesotans and then ultimately to the state budget are something that are challenging to quantify, but are risks, and I think the risks that we have tried to sort of lay out in our recent budget forecast.
Thank you. Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I just wanted to turn our attention just for a moment to something that Budget Director Mingy did not necessarily touch on, but as long as we're talking about economic and budgetary consequences by the federal government on our communities and our livelihoods and our public budgets. I wanted to draw attention to a report that was recently issued by the City of Minneapolis on the matter of Operation Metro Surge and its consequence just to the lives and livelihoods of individuals and businesses and our public budget in Minneapolis. And in case anyone thinks the numbers are being cooked or, you know, we're just pulling them out of thin air, this report effort was led by the Minneapolis's emergency management director, who has extensive experience at the international level in dealing with these kinds of matters, in leading efforts to respond and to quantify and recover this particular crisis that we experienced by the operation of the federal government in action against the people of our state is known as a protection crisis. And this is a conservative number, and this is kind of what can be observed with our eyes and counted. It's estimated that about 76,000 people were directly affected in the most serious and consequential ways, just in Minneapolis. And about $201 million was identified as a consequence just for 1 month. And we know that, of course, the impact and the consequence reverberates and continues to this day. And it takes the form of things like lost wages when people are afraid to leave their homes and go to work. It takes the form of lost revenue, of course, in restaurants and businesses, people staying away from those businesses, employees staying away from those businesses so they couldn't operate, hotel cancellations and the like. Of course, folks who are unable to pay their rent because they're unable to go to work. They don't receive pay for when they don't show up because they're hourly. The need for rental assistance. Food insecurity, of course, tremendous, and the weekly cost of that is quite high. And then something that's a little harder to quantify, but there are going to be many, many children. We've heard a very powerful testimony in committee a couple of days ago from educators, children who are going to be in dire need of support services, mental health services, the aftermath of very, very traumatic experiences that they've had is going to be tremendous. So, Madam Chair, I just think we should keep some of those impacts in mind because, we're trying out of our own efforts, through charitable efforts, to respond. My husband and I both just put word out to friends, and $1,500, actually $2,500 now showed up in our bank account through Venmo, and we're using that money to go shopping and bringing food both to mutual aid hubs as well as specifically shopping for a family and bringing groceries to them, and we're going to be doing that for at least another month. But that's not going to solve the problem. And so obviously we're going to have some discussion around here how to make communities and businesses and individuals and schools not whole, but at least reduce the consequence and the impact and the harm to the extent that we can. We're going to call on the federal government to do their part. They caused this chaos in our community. Madam Chair, if you'll indulge me, I have another matter to draw the committee's attention to, and that is the issue that has gotten a little bit of attention in the media, but not much. I had a briefing with Department of Public Safety a couple of days ago about it. And that's the consequence of what I can only characterize as, asymmetrical action against our state, biased. It feels like it's in this realm of retribution that the president has undertaken against states and cities that he doesn't like because he resents them for whatever reasons he has. And that is, trying to withhold at least $30 million and maybe as much as $65 million, certainly, over the course of a couple of years, it'll be in excess of $60 million from our highway funds that come for a couple of specific purposes relating back to what is actually false claim that we've been improperly administering and issuing what we call non-domiciled commercial driver's licenses, CDLs. There's an annual audit that's done, and if there's anything that needs to be tended to, it's very routine. An accusation was made that was found to be mostly unfounded. Few little issues were addressed. In no circumstance was anyone who is not here with legal presence issued a CDL. And in fact, the claims that were made were actually remedied by how our system treats those CDLs. No one who has a CDL that's deadline is beyond the point at which their credential, whether it's an H-1 visa or whatever it is, if there's a mismatch, the system catches that, and that person either has to renew their CDL credential or relinquish it. And so all of that was addressed in good order, to which the response was not good enough. You have to cancel all of these CDLs. Oh, and by the way, everyone who has them is going to have to reapply under a whole new criteria, of which only a small subset of those CDL holders will then qualify. And so the consequence, and even then, it looks likely that it's not going to be good enough, and there's going to be some rationale and justification to withhold these many tens of millions of dollars from our highway program. And many, many people who are employees in good standing, who help our economy function and run by delivering goods and services, are going to lose their jobs for no reason. It's just completely self-defeating and nonsensical. And then finally, Madam Chair, I mean, I'm happy that our counterparts on the other side of the aisle can, try to minimize the level of the cuts, et cetera, and, it's, attributable to fraud and the like. Because I'm telling you that as this year unfolds and people are going without food, people are going without medical care, clinics and hospitals are being affected. Clinics and hospitals likely will be closing across this state. We can say, oh, no big deal, it's 1% of the budget, it's this, that, and the other. People are going to be very upset. They're going to be very upset about the consequence to their pocketbook by the cuts that have been come through in the energy realm, driving up our energy prices. The lowest form cost of energy is renewable energy. We're being forced, Donald Trump has forced coal plants to reopen and be refurbished at the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. Some of those coal plants are in our service area, even if they are in other states, are going to drive up energy costs. And refusal to fund and support transmission that supports the least form cost of energy. Renewable energy is going to drive up energy costs. People going without health care or are being forced to pay more for their health care overall because of the consequences of these decisions. We can have these kind of abstract conversations about what % of our state's budgets and whether or not this has to do with this, that, or the other. But people are going to feel it in their lives. Young people who are desperate, LGBTQ kids who can find no help because arbitrarily suicide line funding has been cut. That is going to have we're going to lose young people, probably already have lost young people because of those kinds of just mean-spirited, inhumane acts on the part of Donald Trump and his administration. That's the reality of this conversation we're having, which sounds like a bunch of numbers and very high level and very abstract. It has a consequence in people's lives every single day. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I also want to note that Mr. Nauman did get me those numbers. So sales tax is 23.8% of our general fund revenue of that part that we pay, and 11.8 of the total of our fund. So it's a significant amount. I also just want to say, Senator Dibble, you just, when you were talking about the donations going through our communities and the incredible way that our communities have stepped up for mutual aid, it just reminded me that we are a donor state. We pay more to the federal government than we get back. In 2023, we sent $119 billion and got $75 billion back. Like, that's been Minnesota's place for a long time. And so, like, as we get less back, even less back, and have to send more, we're getting less services with that. We're getting, like, less resources with that. We're getting less positive impacts to the people of Minnesota. As our share across the country continues to go up. So we're paying more for less service, and that money is going somewhere else to pay for tax cuts for rich people, for incredibly rich people. Huge amounts of that have gone to pay ICE to terrorize our communities. I just think, like, it is important for us to remember that, like, as a whole, Minnesota gives to the federal government on a significant scale. So an additional 1% less that we're getting matters. And it seems insane to me that my Republican colleagues are like, it's just another 1% that we're giving to the federal government for nothing in return. That feels like, I grew up in South Dakota with a conservative Republican family, and that is like the opposite of fiscal responsibility and pull yourself up by your bootstraps and conservatism and states' rights. That, like, I don't know where that comes from. Like, that is insane to me that Republicans are like, this is cool, we're fine with that. It's no Republican policy I've ever heard of. So, next on our list, Senator Rasmussen, do you have questions for Director Mingy? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Director Mingy, if we could go back to that bar chart that is titled Fiscal Estimates of Lost Federal Funding. Would you mind explaining to me again what is included in there and what's not included in there? Especially since most of it is talking about the impacts to other entities. And a couple of the kind of questions underneath that question is, does it include, savings from like an overall lower welfare budget? Another question would be just in the pre-written report of your remarks today, the numbers are different than what is in the PowerPoint presentation. So I just also want to know which numbers we should be looking at, given that we have different numbers in our report.
Director Mingy.
Madam Chair, Senator Rasmussen, so when we put together the slide and this chart, recognizing that there are sort of many impacts to Minnesotans that the state is not an expert in estimating, things like direct relationships with the federal government, we focus this analysis on things flowing through state-administered programs. So it is most significantly Medicaid and SNAP. There are, what we accounted for here is the loss of federal funds. There are places where there may be state budgetary impacts. There may also be some corresponding state impacts that are not totally accounted for here because they are this is about the loss of federal funds, if that makes sense.
Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just to make sure I understand, there'll be some savings to the state budget from different changes on eligibility for some of these programs, and you're saying that that's not reflected in the numbers that are before the committee.
Director Mingy.
Madam Chair, I would not, and recognizing that there are fiscal notes and budget proposals that you all will see, I would say I would not anticipate significant savings from some of the eligibility changes. For example, the Medicaid work reporting requirements is a provision that largely applies to adults without children who right now the state receives a 90% federal cost share. But what we have seen since the implementation of the Affordable Care Act is something we've referred to in budget forecasts as like a diversion. There are many individuals who may be eligible for medical assistance under a disabled basis of eligibility, and that's a group where the federal government pays about 50%. And our previous analyses, so we've done fiscal notes for bills in the Senate on work requirements, I think back in 2018, and there are sort of similar estimates about how this would go now, but that we anticipate a significant number of folks who would be subject to work requirements would instead enroll as a person with a disability for whom the state would have to pay 50% instead of 10%. So there are potentially some state budgetary impacts as a result of the lost eligibility, but I would just caution that our estimates are not, that those are not going to be significant budgetary savings.
Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I guess another question, and Director Mingy, I've mentioned these numbers a few times, but I went back and looked, and in Governor Walz's budget proposal last year, this was over a 4-year window, there was $1.3 billion in proposed cuts to disability waivers. And then on top of that, over 4 years, there was proposed cuts of $246 million to Minnesota long-term care facilities, i.e. nursing homes, what most people would call those. As budget director, are those numbers accurate or roughly accurate?
Director Mingy.
Madam Chair, Senator Rasmussen, I can't recall specific numbers. Certainly, I think they seem in the appropriate ballpark. The governor's budget emphasized curbing cost growth in some of our fast-growing services, of which disability waivers are sort of among the fastest.
And
Senator Rasmussen.
thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Director Mingy. So if we just assume that it's about $1.5 billion over 4 years, what would be the federal impacts of that? That $1.5 billion was an impact to it was general fund savings in Governor Walz's budget proposal. What would be the federal impact in lost Medicaid funding if those cuts that Governor Walz proposed last year went into effect?
Director Mingy.
Madam Chair, the federal matching percentage for Medicaid is about 51 or 52%. So I think you can, so it's close to a 1-to-1.
Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Director Mingy. So just to make sure I'm understanding this correct, so just within the Human Services Committee, we had Governor Walz proposed a $1.5 billion general fund cut to disability service and nursing homes, but that would also have a follow-on effect of an additional $1.5 billion cut from federal Medicaid as a part of that budget proposal. Am I thinking about that the right way?
Director Mingy.
Madam Chair, yes, I think cuts to medical assistance at a state level, unless it's a state-only funded benefit, have a corresponding reduction in federal share. And for those services there, they don't have that enhanced federal match, so it is roughly 1-to-1.
Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Director Mingy. And I guess, I've heard from Governor Walz about, his concerns with some of these, changes that you've outlined here today for the committee. I guess I'm trying to understand why, just a few months ago, we had the governor propose a $3 billion cut to Medicaid programs, but now he's saying he's very concerned about these other cuts that, to me, look to be smaller in terms of the numbers that are presented here on the page.
Director Mingy.
Madam Chair, Senator Rasmussen, I think certainly I can't, I'm not here to speak on behalf of the governor. I would say that there are the impacts presented by some of the changes that we've spoken about today are losses of federal funds that are not accompanied in losses in state level obligations. And so to the extent we lose federal funds, but the state is still required to make the same payments to our, for our enrollees or to our providers, that is something that creates budget pressure that you all will have to grapple with. One of the potential responses to that is to make changes to the obligations that the state has. And that could be in the form of cuts in our long-term care programs, but certainly is not isolated to that. So I would just draw the distinction between a cut to the revenue that we're receiving that just sort of reduces the resources to the state compared to the reductions in the obligations the state has to make payments.
Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My last question is, I just want, and thank you, Director Mingy. I appreciate the conversation on this. My last question is just, do we know what numbers are correct? We have on the PowerPoint page for the 26-27 biennium automatic state cost forecast changes of $223 million, but in the memo we have, it says $208 million. So just wanted to see which numbers we should be thinking about.
Thank you, Senator Rasmussen. We'd already flagged that, and Senator Naumann can speak to that.
So, Madam Chair, Senator, if I can call your attention to the section of the report titled Federal Fund Summary. We'll call this falling victim to attempting to capture what MMB was about to testify to. and not catching all the updates that they had presented here this morning. So in the first paragraph, the number should read, these estimates total not 312 million, but 327 million. And then I have a further recommendation that in the very first bullet, the parenthetical should read 223 million and 480 million in FY 28-29. That would comport with the PowerPoint presentation and the testimony that was provided to the subcommittee.
Mr. Nauman, can you read that last number, 223 million and?
480 million in 2028-29. I've made these updates already to the live copy, and it's not online, but I've provided it to Ms. Carlson.
Thank you. Senator Rasmussen, that was your last question? Yes. Okay. Does anyone have questions for Director Mingy? Senator Makewaite.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, this might be a question for Mr. Nauman. Is that, may I? Okay. I had asked earlier, Director Mingy, about what, as this legislature, we should be thinking about decisions we know we need to make this session, and then if we're out of session and we have more concrete guidance for things that will be implemented shortly thereafter. I guess I'm just, from a budget perspective, from the Senate perspective, how much information do we have to make decisions right now or in this time frame of session, and how much don't we have? I want to be very careful because nonpartisan staff have to answer nonpartisanly, so I'm just trying to, yeah.
And I think you ask a very important question, Senator and Madam Chair. I think there are many things that we do know, and there are many things that we don't know, and I think that's largely what you've heard from the testimony this morning. I think we're going to struggle to have full information on information that the federal government hasn't yet provided. I mean, we learned during the COVID experience, when guidance was happening very quickly, how important the guidance from the federal government was on the implementation of federal law. Sadly, when Congress passes a law, it is less specific than when we do it here in Minnesota in many cases. That's not to ascribe a value to that, it's just a reality, and so that you depend so heavily on the guidance. Given the sequencing and that timeline chart that Ms. Mingy, Director Mingy provided to the subcommittee, I think is useful because all the major changes have the colored boxes tend to indicate where the changes are effective. And because of that longer timeline, there's a lot of information that we simply don't yet have. That puts the Minnesota Senate, the House too, and the governor's office all in the challenging position of trying to do its best clairvoyance on what might be happening and try to anticipate those fiscal challenges as they come. And I think the reality is that we're going to be making policy for those things that we know that we have information on, and then we're going to probably have to continue into the next session and maybe even the session after that. I know that answer, Senator, is imprecise and not as helpful as you were probably hoping for, but that's how I'm thinking about it.
Senator McQuaid.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Mr. Nauman, it was helpful. I appreciate it. Director Mingy, the last question I have for you, and it is so specific, and I apologize, but it's one that just keeps coming onto my mind. The work reporting requirements that the counties will have to implement starting, I believe, December of this year?
Madam Chair, the work requirements are effective like January 1 of 2027, but there are certain notification periods that we will need to hit in advance.
Senator McQuaid.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, Director, you're right. They will be implemented Jan 1, but they have to look back at least November, December of 26. So will the state need to create a system for that work reporting requirements, or is this something that each county, all 87 counties, can come up with on their own?
Director Mingy.
Madam Chair, I have a colleague from DHS who's probably best able to answer that question. I would say that largely there are policy choices to be made about some of these pieces as well, but I'm not sure if Ms. Bailey is. if you'd like Ms. Bailey to come to the table to answer more specifics.
Welcome. Please introduce yourself and proceed.
Thank you, Chair, members of the committee. My name is Elise Bailey. I'm the Budget Director at the Department of Human Services. This is a great discussion, and we're doing a lot of work at the department on mapping out what exactly needs to take place absent federal guidance. To some of the questions earlier of how will we map it out without federal guidance, we have a group of other states that we're working with and do have interactions with CMS in terms of what we can predict the guidance to say, but we don't have the actual guidance. So there is always a risk that we are mapping out how we will implement this item, and then we get the guidance in June and the bill is passed and we have to shift. In terms of what we're mapping out right now, we are working really hand in hand with counties on these changes are the biggest changes since the ACA. And they will result in a lot of work for our local governments, tribes and counties. So we are mapping out right now what kind of systems adjustments we could do in the background to mitigate both workload at the county level, but also mitigate people falling off of the program even when they're still eligible, just for, say, not returning a document or not getting a letter in the mail. So we're mapping out what kind of things we can do electronically. We're also looking into what kind of external vendors we can utilize for this extra level of paperwork that we'll have to take in at the state to determine whether someone's eligible for the work requirements. So that will be a big component. What can we do at the state to mitigate the workload challenges at the counties? We're trying to make sure that they have as few changes at the county level as possible.
Senator McQuaid.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Director Bailey. I think Dakota County alone is anticipating having to hire like 47 people, which is a lot of people to administer this. The part about third-party vendors, the ones that currently exist, and this is coming from the education space, right? Every time they're like, we need a new test, I'm like, who's the test vendor? These third-party vendors that would be helpful, do they have ties to this administration, or are they donors to this administration? Or, I mean, I'm wondering about that.
Director Bailey.
Chair, Senator McQuaid, my understanding is we would do a competitive RFP. And so we would be assessing, obviously, the history of the vendor and all of the requirements that we're asking them to do. So I can't answer specifically what vendor we'll use because I think we'll do it a competitive RFP. Thank you.
Senator McQuaid. All right, members, any further questions? All right, thank you very much. Members, anything further? Senator Marty.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to second something that that Senator Port said earlier, because we often talk about how this federal money is their generosity to us and so on. And as Chair pointed out earlier, basically Minnesotans are paying $44–45 billion a year more to the federal government than we're getting back. So even these little things make a difference. And the second thing I wanted to say, when Senator McQuaid was asking about what we know and what we will know, and Mr. Nauman said we may need to have some clairvoyance about what's going to happen. This chart on the federal fiscal estimates of lost federal funding from H.R. 1, the total shows that $1.6 billion in the out biennium, and that's the little bit we know, and the Medicaid thing alone there would be adding like $6 billion to that, $6+ billion to that. So it just dwarfs just that one thing. And those are, I'd argue, fairly, I'd call them arbitrary and capricious decisions, other than the fact I think there's some political retribution in it. And so I think that we're going to be having extreme trouble trying to figure out what's going to happen, because it changes day by day, and that kind of threats are hard to deal with. And then the final thing I wanted to comment on real briefly was the multi-billion-dollar impact of the ICE invasion. we talk about that. It is multi-billions of dollars. It's been a hit to the economy. And a lot of that, I don't know how we're going to measure it or if we ever can, but just the trauma for people who, PTSD and so on, for all those little school kids who have been traumatized for a long time. And I've seen how some of them have been reacting, and in the media there have been some horrific cases, but I think we're going to be spending a lot more in mental health and education costs for decades to come because of this. I don't know, we can't quantify that right now, but I think we got to keep that in mind, because that is going to be more real than the additional policing costs and public safety costs and loss to businesses costs and loss to family economic costs. So I just hope we keep that in mind as we look forward.
Thank you, Senator Marty. Before we continue on closing comments, I do want to move us to adopting the nonpartisan summaries. And Senator Dibble moves that we adopt the nonpartisan summaries from January 15th and the updated summary that is in all of your emails from Friday, February 20th.
Madam Chair.
Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just was wondering if I could offer some additional amendments to the February 20th report.
What amendments would you like to offer?
Thank you, Madam Chair. On paragraph 1, add after the last sentence, insert, Director Mingy testified that federal funding for Minnesota's Medicaid program will increase year over year. Period.
I'm going to have counsel read that back when she's ready.
Senator Rasmussen, could you please repeat that to make sure I have all of it?
Yes, so first page, first paragraph, after last sentence, insert, Director Mingy testified that federal funding for Minnesota's Medicaid program will increase year over year.
Discussion, members. Senator McQuaid.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think the sum total of the comments around this, and Director Mingy did clarify that there is a difference between, and I would have to go back and look at the transcript, there's a difference between the state obligations that we lay out and the federal government cutting money to the state while our obligations remain the same. And I think, you know, especially when we're looking at budgeting, the fact, it'd be like saying, you know, I made $5,000 more this year, but I had to spend $20,000 more. Yes, I made more money, I had to spend more money because I, you know, had a kid or whatever, costs went up. And so I think it would be inaccurate to just say the funding will increase year over year, because it always does, but our obligations also increase year over year as more people age into needing Medicaid or have disabilities or what have you. And so that wouldn't accurately reflect the budget impact of that.
Senator Marty.
Madam Chair, the other concern I have is we don't know. I mean, if we have a $2 billion a year cut, that will be going down for several years. Senator Rasmussen, I think she responded to your question saying, yeah, because that's the way the trends are going. But you have one hit like that be so massive, it would turn the scope, not just the aim of the cost of the programs, but would actually go down in federal spending for a couple of years.
Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think my statement was pretty simple. I didn't even add that Director Mingy estimated that it would be going up by hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars over the time period, but I think it's a factual statement that Director Mingy testified that federal funding for Minnesota's Medicaid program will increase year over year, and would request a roll call on the amendment.
Senator Mann.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, adding that statement without context completely misses and erases the entire hearing. So I would urge members to vote no.
Roll call has been requested. Roll call will be granted. The clerk will take the roll.
Chair Port,
No.
Senator Dibble,
No.
Senator May Quaid,
No.
Senator Mann,
No.
Senator Rasmussen. Senator Marty,
Madam Chair, I vote no, but I'm not sure if I count because I'm an ex officio member
so
of the committee.
sorry. Yeah. Senator Kupek,
No.
Senator Nelson, Senator Utke, and Senator Curran.
With 1 aye and 5 noes, the amendment is not adopted. Additional comments on adopting these reports? Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm just disappointed that, again, with one of these reports, it was drafted ahead of time before we actually had the testimony. And then when we had a conversation on the testimony, a factual statement that Director Mingy presented to the committee was now not able to be included because members of the committee didn't like that fact. And unfortunately, Madam Chair, to me, that means that this is not a nonpartisan summary. It's now become a partisan summary because it's been unwilling to reflect the testimony that was presented in front of this committee in a holistic way. And so I'll be voting against the report.
Senator Dibble.
Madam Chair, I just need to respond. A narrow fact, absent context, does not shed information or light on a particular matter. And I think it was well stated by Budget Director Mingy, as well as members of this panel, that in context, while there may be a nominal increase in dollars, then that nominal increase is insufficient to meet the need. I think Senator May Quaid put it as simply and as best as possible. So anyone who's listening, and for the record, the fact of the matter is that a nominal increase, if it's not keeping up with increasing demand or the consequence in other areas or inflation, does not actually in a practical way amount to an increase. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, Senator Dibble renews his motion to adopt the nonpartisan summary reports from January 15th, 2026 and February 20th, 2026. All in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No. The motion is adopted. Back to my list of closing comments. If you want to get on the list, please let us know. Sorry, Senator Dibble, I have you here, but okay. Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm not going to repeat comments I made earlier in the committee on the presentation, but one point I did want to agree with you on is that Minnesota is a donor state to the federal government. Every year, Minnesotans pay more in federal taxes than we receive in federal funding, and that has been true under Democrat presidents. It's been true under Republican presidents. It's been true with Congresses controlled by the Democratic Party and Congresses controlled by the Republican Party. It's been a pretty persistent trend that we've seen. And Madam Chair, what that should mean for Minnesotans is that a bigger, more expensive federal government means that we become an even bigger donor state, that our state economy loses more money as the federal government gets bigger and more expensive. And that's why Minnesotans should want an efficient government at the federal level that's rooting out fraud. We should want an efficient government here in Minnesota that is rooting out fraud. And I think, Madam Chair, that that's what I hope this session focuses on, is how can we protect taxpayer money and ensure that those dollars are going to the Minnesotans who need it the most, whether those are vulnerable Minnesotans on disability services that Governor Walz tried to cut by more than $1 billion, or Minnesotans in nursing homes who Governor Walz has proposed to cut by hundreds of millions of dollars. We need to make sure that we're protecting tax dollars and they're going where they should. And I look forward to working in a bipartisan basis on that work ahead this session.
Senator May Quaid.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. We had a teacher testify yesterday in Education Finance about how so often teachers in schools hear, there's not enough money, and I'm so sorry there's not enough money, but that during this administration, we've actually seen that there is plenty of money. It's just not for the people of this country and certainly not for the people of this state. The Trump administration is buying airplanes for secretaries. It's ironic that the ballroom that is being constructed on the White House is almost the exact amount of money that we are outright losing in federal funds just to our state budget. $10 billion of taxpayer money to the Board of Peace, whatever the heck that is. Hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, actually $75 billion to terrorize our communities, kidnap our babies, murder our citizens in the street with impunity. We have seen where our tax dollars are going. We have seen what they're doing with our tax dollars. And on top of that, they are cutting taxes for the wealthiest people in this country, and doing so, paying for it by cutting our health care and our food and our energy assistance and our environmental regulations. I mean, people are furious, and they should be. What world are we living in right now? Like, this is absolutely insane. And it is a deliberate sabotage on behalf of Republicans and Trump in Washington, with the blessing of Republicans in this legislature. It is so wild to me to hear my colleagues rail against a proposed budget from a year ago that didn't pass, instead of the actual budget that was passed by their own colleagues in Congress that cut our health care and cut our food and supercharged a lawless paramilitary to roam our streets masked that has more money than the FBI. They pulled people off of researching and investigating child sex crimes to murder our citizens. Like, this is where we're at, and people see it, and they feel it, and they know what is happening. And so this session is going to be spent trying to respond to the absolute economic and literal siege that Minnesota has been put under, to address the trauma to our residents, our children, our babies, our teachers, our doctors, our nurses, our business owners, to try to cobble together some sort of support for the counties as they hire hundreds more people to provide less services. Talk about efficient government. As people get sicker and they end up in the emergency room with Senator Mann for strep throat when they could have seen a primary care provider, but sorry, they don't have health insurance anymore because they couldn't afford it, or they got kicked off of it because they were a lawful permanent resident, a legal immigrant in this country, because we just hate everybody who's black and brown. I mean, it is just absurd what is happening in this country. Yesterday, we had a press conference about ICE and the bills that are being passed right now in the Senate Judiciary Committee. And the questions were like, well, what if the federal government doesn't follow the law? What are you going to do then? And where are we? Where that is the question that the press has to press us on. What are you going to do when the federal government violates the law, like it continues to do, like it has been proven to do? Ignore court orders in Minnesota and across the country. So I have these moments of incredulity because people in my community, people across the state are watching every single day while Trump is like, look at my gold on the wall and look at my new ballroom and look at my new Institute of Peace or whatever, while people struggle to buy food, while their hospitals close. This is, I just have never in my life would have imagined that I would have spent my 30s and going into my 40s fighting this and having to fight with my own people in my own state to say, like, look at reality. Like, look at what is happening. There has to be a line. We've crossed it many, many times. I just beg my Republican colleagues to find a line and hold it.
Thank you, Senator McQuaid. Senator Mann.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So we just heard about the devastating effects of this federal government. We've been hearing about this all week in every single committee. The devastation that they're bringing down in Minnesota, and this is being defended. This is somehow being defended. And defended by saying things like, well, we should be aware that we are going to get more money year over year from the federal government. And then also blaming the state for trying to balance a budget, while we just heard that our budget is actively being sabotaged by the federal government. But what is missing from that defense argument is the billions of dollars being cut along the way, right? The $2 billion to childcare and food, the $1.4 billion to healthcare, the millions of people who are not going to have any access to healthcare, and as you mentioned, Madam Chair, the families having to leave the workforce because lack of childcare. So all of this will increase the cost of the state's needs, and the money that we are getting from the federal government does not cover the level of destruction that these cuts along the way are causing. Now, this is not new by any stretch of the imagination. We have seen this in many, many other countries, where in order to stay in power, the federal government destroys the infrastructure of society. They increase poverty, increase crime, increase unemployment, decrease literacy, increase the death rate. And then they throw peanuts back at the people. And they say, you should be thankful. You should be thankful for these peanuts. And it kills me that there's people sitting up here and in this body that are like, yay for the peanuts. Thank you, peanuts. And defending the peanuts. Like the $2 million that was mentioned, that's going back to MDH, when they are on the hook for losing so much more than that. And the hospital's losing funding from all the Medicaid cuts, but are getting some money back through the rural health program, which covers a fraction of their losses. We have hospitals in Minnesota that are going to close their doors within 2 years if we do nothing. But we're like, yay for the peanuts. Let's defend what's going on. So again, the federal government is destroying our infrastructure and throwing peanuts back at the people. Stop clapping for the peanuts.
I really hate that I always have to follow you. Y'all, I'm exhausted. My heart is exhausted. This committee was emotionally and mentally exhausting. I want to thank all the testifiers who have added critical contributions to this committee over the last 6 months. I don't think anyone receiving any of the information today can say that they feel good about it. But in the days of Donald Trump, I will take getting upset over truth over propaganda. This 1 week from today, we will receive the budget forecast, and the public will get that budget forecast. And based on today's testimony, I think there's every reason to expect it's not going to be great. Planned legislated cutbacks to healthcare and food security by Donald Trump and Republicans will have devastating long-term impact, bankrupting our state, hundreds of Minnesota communities, and hundreds of thousands of households. People will lose their jobs, their access to healthcare, and their lives. This is the best case scenario right now. I want to repeat that. As we've heard today, Republican efforts to destroy the health and economic future for hundreds of thousands of Minnesotans is the best case scenario. That's the plan. That's their plan for this state and for states like ours around the country. And the silence of our GOP Senate and House colleagues is deafening. Minnesotans being kicked off of healthcare, out of nursing homes, and off of food resources is not a savings, as Senator Rasmussen called it. It's a loss of stability and absolutely necessary resources for our state. We know we're right to worry about so much more than that. If Trump continues this campaign of defunding Minnesota, if he exceeds in his attempts to punish Minnesotans by arbitrarily canceling contracts, defunding childcare, food support, healthcare, the devastation isn't the forecast, it's the weather. It's what's happening to us right now. And we need to emphasize this is not happening in states that Donald Trump won. It's not happening in Iowa and the Dakotas. It's not happening in Florida or Texas, which have higher error rates and fraud rates than we do here in Minnesota. It's being stolen from struggling families to give tax breaks to the super rich, and the people in those states will suffer too, but not like this. Trump promised retribution. That was his word, retribution, against certain states and people, and has come after Minnesota like no other. Programs that help families, seniors, and kids got slashed so that Trump could hire and arm federal agents and send them to Minnesota to attack our people. Those were our tax dollars paying for masked men in our street to disappear our neighbors. As legislators, we need to pay attention and call out the threat, whether it's a line on a budget sheet or an agent at a door, and do what we can to act. I want to thank our committee members, our nonpartisan and caucus staff, the sergeants, the Senate media and state agencies and employees and advocacy groups and independent experts and thousands of Minnesotans who have contributed to this select committee's work these past 5 months when the Senate hasn't been in session. As we resume the session routine of meetings, hearings, and floor sessions, this is currently the last scheduled session for this committee. That doesn't mean we won't meet again, but there's nothing planned at this moment. But I do know this won't be the last time that we need to hear from experts on what this federal government is trying to do to us, from the people on what it would mean to them, and from each other on how we fight back for Minnesotans. We're all exhausted and devastated, but at least some of us are committed to fight alongside Minnesotans. This committee is adjourned.